Good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Reaganhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And before we get started today, I just wanted to thank those of you. We have a large audience today, and it's a diverse geographically as well. And so we're very pleased to have such a large number of attendees. Just a few housekeeping issues. Because of the large number of participants, we ask that you keep your cameras off and remain muted. We'll take all communication through the chat feature. And today's talk, which concerns high-rise fire safety in residential buildings in New York and more generally around the country. So with that, I'll turn it to Glenn Corbett, who's going to be moderating today.
Okay, thank you, Charles. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm a colleague at Charles's at John Jay College, associate professor, and I've been at the college for about 26 years. So today's webinar is to a great extent not only retrospective but also looking forward. We're going to be talking about the aftermath of the Twin Parks fire in the Bronx a few months ago. We're actually not going to be talking about that fire specifically. We're going to be talking more about issues of high-rise fire safety, particularly in existing high-rise buildings. Historically, if you go back in time and you look at some important moments in our history of high-rises, more recently, 1971 was pretty much kind of a defining moment in terms of our regulatory approach to high-rises. It was back then that, again, 1971 in Washington, there was a conference called the International Conference on Fire Safety in High-Rise Buildings. It was sponsored by, most notably, the General Services Administration, with assistance from organizations like the NFPA and particularly the National Bureau of Standards, and now we call NIST. They brought everyone together at that moment to sort of figure out what do we need to do with high-rises, because if some of you have been around a while know that the period, particularly in the 70s, was a major turning point for us in terms of our codes and things like that, regulatory approaches, because we had so many significant both office building and residential high rises for that roughly from the late 60s up through the early 80s. We had many of them. And it was that conference that sort of set in motion where we ended up in the late 70s, which was to put in what we would call today the high-rise package. So a set of requirements for brand new high-rises going forward. So that included things like sprinklers, of course.
Hi, son.
So there we go. So to wrap up what I was saying here earlier is that we basically got the sort of in the late 70s, got the, we again call high-rise package of requirements for new high-rises. That includes, again, sprinklers, smoke detection, fire alarm systems, public address systems, smoke-proof enclosures, the whole 9 yards. We got all those things, which we pretty much enjoy today. It's in the code. So the new buildings we have since, like I said, since let's say around 1980, have for the most part incorporated all those systems with some exceptions, particular cities, including New York, that didn't actually adopt those until after 9/11. So nationally, we're in a much better situation with high rises, again, since roughly around 1980. But the buildings we're going to talk about today, these existing high rises, including residential, those are the ones that present a significant hazard, as we saw with the Twin Parks fire. So again, we're going to talk about these buildings and specifics and what we think we might be able to do to existing buildings to sort of bring them closer to being much more fire safe, of course, than they are today. So we have a series of speakers today. The first one is actually who we just heard from, Charles Jennings. He'll be talking a little bit more retrospectively and statistically about where we are with these types of buildings. He'll be followed by our friend Ali from Thornton Tomasetti, a structural engineer, who will be talking about resiliency in these buildings. He'll be followed by Jeff Harper from Chicago. So we're going to hear a little bit of a Chicago perspective from a fire protection engineer out there who has some experience in actually dealing with existing high-rise buildings. And then finally, we'll hear from Atenedoro, Gonzalez from the task force, one of our city council staffers who is working on a task force post Twin Parks. So without further ado, let me bring Charles in. Charles, would you like to talk again a little bit about our data and our fire record and things like that?
Sure, Glenn, just give me a quick second here to get things moving.
And while you're doing that, Charles, I forgot to mention, we'll have a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat room. And when our final speaker has made his presentation, then I'll go to the questions and we'll see what we can come up, see if we can come up with some answers. So there you go.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn. So really, there's a lot we could say about the problem of fires in existing residential high-rise buildings. And the fire record is fairly well established and fairly well defined in terms of failure modes and adverse events. And New York City has accumulated a reasonable body of experience in terms of these outcomes, and we have a number of people on the call today who are intimately familiar with them, and so we're not going to spend too much time on that. But I think it's important to bear in mind for those as we approach this problem is the need to kind of systematically look at the magnitude of the problem in terms of how many buildings are there, how big are they, et cetera. And this, now nobody run off and quote any of the numbers in this. This was a real quick first pass using tax assessor data for the city of New York and using an arbitrary cutoff of 100 feet, but to look at basically the year built, basically tall buildings by borough and year built. So if you look here, we see the big decade was 60 to 69 in terms of construction of tall buildings. Importance of this is that we could put this up against regulatory requirements. And depending on how you slice the data in terms of cutoffs, and of course you have plan filing dates, et cetera, and those other vagaries, you can get a rough approximation of what share of your building stock is equipped with various protection systems. And the range of systems that are available in New York is pretty large, right? From basically just relying on passive structural fire resistance all the way up through active fire suppression systems. And so as we see here, the cohort of interest here in the tax parlance is elevator apartments. And this is just a representative count based on kind of the arbitrary criteria that we did use. But that's basically the first thing to do to get a handle on the problem. And it's important to bear in mind that the fire problem, by and large, lives in the existing building stock. And while we have and put into place code requirements, those code requirements generally only apply to newly constructed buildings. And as much new construction as there has been in the city, and there's been a great deal of it, the existing building stock persists, and that building stock will persist for decades and decades and decades. And as we see, it goes back into the 1890s here in New York City. So as a consequence of the fire, there was a flurry of federal legislation. Some of it was post Twin Parks, some of it was actually kind of revived legislative proposals that had already been in existence. And some of these that the audience should be aware of is at the federal level, the High-Rise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act. This is legislation which is provided, basically changes the tax code to make expenditures on retrofit of sprinklers in high-rise buildings more attractive. And these are all legislative proposals. None of these have passed yet. The second is the Public Housing Fire Safety Act. Interestingly, in 1992, Congress required sprinklers in new multifamily housing, federally, assisted, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development estimates there are approximately 570,000 public housing units that were pre-existing this legislation that may need to be retrofitted with sprinklers, and that, given the Twin Parks fire and the fact that it was assisted housing, threw that into relief. And then there's been a number of legislative proposals from Representative Torres, who was, everybody knows, from the Bronx and was formerly on New York City Council. And so Twin Parks was in his district. And these are HR 7077, empowering the U.S. Fire Administration Act. The U.S. Fire Administration is the federal fire agency for kind of conventional structure fires and fire service issues. And that would give them, strengthen their authority to investigate large loss fires. That legislation was introduced post Twin Parks and has already passed the House and is now in committee in the Senate. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And as an aside, the U.S. Fire Administration in the past did operate a investigative program, which has fallen off over the years. And so this would be a welcome development to see them get back into that business in terms of being able to document and produce lessons learned from notable fires. HR 6528 requires temperature sensors in federally subsidized housing. Those are not heat detectors. That's sensors to ensure provision of adequate and consistent heat, which goes back again to Twin Parks and the concerns that were raised about the heating system and the reliance on space heaters. And then HR 6529 would require owners of covered federally assisted rental dwelling units to install self-closing doors in such units. And that legislation is in committee in the House also. So there are precedents, and having been very involved in post 9/11 advocacy work around tall building fire safety, someone asked me, well, why didn't you do anything with residential buildings after 9/11? And I had to pause for a minute and say, well, I think the whole world was focused on office buildings at that time, and so that's where the attention went. And I know there's always difficulties around broadening these requirements, but New York City did implement Local Law 26 back in 2004, which gave the second dates on all these are supposedly the end dates for office buildings to be equipped with sprinklers. Philadelphia, following One Meridian Plaza, put in a commercial high-rise retrofit law, originally set to go out a 6-year period. Massachusetts did a retrofit law. Phoenix, Chicago, interestingly, required that high-rise buildings are subject to code equivalency analysis. That was shoulder to shoulder with a commercial sprinkler mandate. Atlanta did a commercial high-rise, actually did all high-rise following the Peachtree 25th fire. The U.S. Fire Administration has a great investigative report out on that. And Louisiana did all high-rises back in 1991 with a runway that went out to 1999. Now, the reality is there's always exceptions. And so if you go into any one of these communities, does that mean they have 100% coverage? Probably not. I know New York is not unique in that fashion in terms of people can claim hardship and other issues to run those out, but there's substantial compliance moving forward. And so there are precedents for retrofit of sprinklers. So to summarize real quickly, as I said, the fire problem lives largely in existing buildings, and to the degree that those buildings are unchanged, that fire problem is going to be undiminished. High-rise residential buildings are generally less regulated than commercial uses for a number of reasons. There's a well-established literature on fire risks and incidents of fire associated with income, vulnerability, and other factors. The failure mode of compartmentation in New York City residential high-rises implicates apartment doors not being closed, and we've seen lots of examples of that here in New York, prior to Twin Parks. And the typical regulatory approach is that local regulation is introduced following a large loss fire. And so that concludes my remarks, Glenn.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Next up, we have Ali Ashrafi, and Ali's is our structural engineer from Thornton Tomasetti, who's going to talk about resilience, fire safety resilience in existing high-rise buildings. So, Ali, thank you.
Thank you, Glenn and Charles, and I want to thank the Reagan Heart Center too for starting this conversation because it's a really important topic that applies just not to New York, but basically anywhere where we have a lot of existing buildings. And so let me talk a little bit about fire resilience. And so let me first define what I mean here. By resilience, I mean the ability of a system, in this case, a building, people inside of it, to take a shock and be able to ride that shock and have manageable consequences and limit those consequences and ultimately rebound from that shock. So that's a broad definition of resilience to use here. And this is a concept that's relevant to all hazards. We certainly use it in the context of other life-threatening forces such as earthquakes and winds, but there are also different ways that those hazards are handled compared to fire. So for example, if you look at how we define and design for the risks of earthquakes and winds for buildings, the probability of loss of life in those cases is actually very explicitly included in the design. And so that's something that the design explicitly looks at. There's targets, and you're designing to bring the probability of loss of life to below a minimum level. And so because that risk to life is quantified and minimized as part of the design process, when you're looking at the question of resilience, a lot of times the discussion of resilience tends to focus on recovery of buildings and communities after the event. So let's say you have a large earthquake event and you've designed for life safety, but the resilience discussion could focus on making sure that after that event, you've established life safety, but the building and the community can come back and start functioning sooner as opposed to later. Although you could also look at heightened level of life safety as part of that resilience discussion. So that's how other hazards are treated. Typically, when it comes to fire, the codes deal with the fire a little different. So they do intend to minimize the risk to life, but they do not quantify that as part of the design process. And so because it's not explicitly looked at in the context of design, when you're looking at resilience here, we really do need to pay closer attention to the life safety question in fire as part of the resilience discussion. And then certainly you could also look at what happens to the building after the fire and making sure that you have a limited impact on the building. So with that broad definition, when we're looking at fire resilience of buildings, I think the most helpful definition here would be that we're really looking at a building and thinking of it as resilient in fire if a small fire event does not result in large consequences inside the building for risk to life and risk to the building. So a resilient building would be a building that manages to mitigate the risk and keep a local risk, a local event, a local risk, not a large disproportionate risk. And so in that context, when we look at how the building codes try to protect people inside the building, they take a multi-layered approach to safety. So they provide layers of measures of fire safety protections. And together, having all those measures, the goal is to minimize the risk to life. And so if we look at those measures in 5 broad categories, we have measures that are for detection, alarm, and suppression of fire and smoke. And so here the goal is to not allow something to grow. If something is brewing, maybe you can control and extinguish the fire. You also notify people early on so that they can respond to it quickly. They can get away from the source of the fire. So that's one set of measures that we have. There are measures that are there to protect the means of egress so that you allow for people to go from where they are to somewhere that's really safe and do that in a way that they're not subject to harm along that path. Then there are measures that are there to provide compartmentation for the fire and for the smoke, so that when you have a fire in some area, you have a long period of time when the fire and the smoke stays in that area. And again, it allows time for the people inside the building, for the fire service to respond and have a local problem, not a larger problem. The next layer of safety measures is measures that are there to actually allow the fire service to have an effective response. So when they come to the building, these are the infrastructure, the tools that allow the fire service to help people inside the building and also attack the fire and smoke in an effective manner. And finally, we have measures that are there to protect the structure itself so that the building is standing there and it's safe, and it allows for everyone inside the building, the occupants, the fire service, to have the time to respond appropriately and be within a safe environment structurally. So those are the layers of safety that are provided within the code to achieve the final goals of life safety in fire. And so in that context, when we want to look at the question of resilience, it really comes down to looking at that system and stress testing it analytically. So we look at that system, and first we look at it. Let's assume that everything is properly designed and properly maintained. Are there any possibilities where a local fire in some area could result in large disproportional impact inside the building? So that's the first layer of the check. But then the second level is we are really talking about tens, maybe in some cases hundreds of measures that are applicable to different parts of a building to provide that overall safety system. What happens if 1, 2, 3 of these multiple components don't operate as intended? If is losing 1, 2, or 3 of these different parts of the system, is it going to result in collapse of your fire safety system? So now you have a local event resulting in a very large disproportionate risk to life, or can we still mitigate that risk, keep it local, and manage to keep people safe by and large? And so that's the question of the fire resilience that we want to handle. And if there are areas where you see if 1, 2, 3 components of the system don't function as intended, we have the chance of having larger consequences to the people inside the building. Then the question becomes, what are the most effective means of dealing with such scenarios and being able to respond to them in real time, and having the tools so that the people inside the building and the fire service can together manage that risk and keep the impact minimal. So that's the broad framework of fire resilience when we're looking at buildings here. And so if we take that and now we look at existing tall buildings, and especially existing tall residential buildings, there are a few things to keep in mind. One is, as Charles mentioned very well, a lot of these buildings are built to older codes. And so what that means is that they are built to lower code requirements, right? And so you are starting from a different baseline. And then the second piece is, certainly we do want to have good maintenance of these systems, and it's important to stay on top of that and make sure that we can have as good of maintenance as possible. But when we look at it broadly, and we're looking at from the perspective of a lot of buildings inside large cities, we know that we won't have perfect maintenance and perfect compliance, right? And so it goes back to the question of, if you don't assume perfection, what are the things that are more likely to cause these large disproportionate consequences? And what are the best ways for us to be able to mitigate them? Certainly, a part of the answer is to maintain the buildings properly and enforce the existing code. So that's certainly important, but we also need to be realistic that not everything will be perfect in real time. And so the one point I want to highlight here is that, as I mentioned, the building codes have, broadly speaking, 5 categories of measures that they use to provide fire safety. And so if we have something break as in one of these categories, we have the full range of tools that are out there to potentially help us mitigate. So when we're looking at it, is it something regarding communication? Is it something regarding notification, detection, or suppression? Is it something regarding the protection of means of egress? Are these measures regarding giving the fire service better tools or better means of communicating with people inside the building and having better information? We do need to look at the full range of potential solutions that are out there to see what are the most effective ways for us to be able to improve the resilience of existing buildings, knowing that we're not starting from a perfect place. And so, especially given the fact that this is not a problem for New York or Chicago or San Francisco or London, it's a problem that applies everywhere. The answer, the right answer, could be different depending on your location and depending on what is practical as a halfway measure. So we just need to be conscious of the broad range of potential solutions that are out there, and everyone who is in the fire safety arena, we have to work together to come up with what all those solutions are. Some of them we might know, some of them we might have to work together to find the most effective solutions. And so with that, I think give it back to Glenn. Jeff would be the right person to talk about some of those measures.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. That was well stated. Thank you very much. So Jeff again is our fire protection engineer from Chicago, is affiliated with Jensen Hughes out there. And so Jeff, take it away. Okay. Jeff was unfortunately having to work off his phone, so we'll have to give him another second. Here he is. I think here he is. Okay. Jeff, it's
sorry.
yeah.
I thought it was just the mute key on my phone, not the *6. Okay, so now I know you can hear me. Okay, well, thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. And yes, I'll apologize to all in advance. I am unfortunately at another conference. I stepped in kind of last minute for a colleague, and so I don't have my computer, and so you don't have my picture, but. What I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to reinforce some of the things that that Ali has talked about, and that is, you know, when when I was a young engineer back before 9/11, back before there were a lot of existing building codes or codes for what to do in an existing building, one of my mentors basically reinforced to me as I was looking at, you know, lots of existing buildings, and including especially in high rises. And he basically said, look, you know, absent any other guidance, you can reasonably assure life safety to the building occupants if you can meet these 4 things. So not too far off of what Ali said. He said 5. But the first one really is you got to have the ability to detect the fire. You certainly could rely on manual detection and somebody to pull station, but we all know that may not be terribly reliable. So having that ability to be able to detect the fire, whether that's smoke detection or whether that's a water flow switch on a sprinkler system, you've got an ability to detect the fire. So that's really critical, number one. Second is the ability to notify the occupants. Once you are able to identify that the fire is occurring or is present in the building, you want to be able to alert occupants so they can begin to make decisions about their own safety. So you have to have some sort of a system, and there's a number of different ways you can approach it, but you got to have some sort of a system to be able to alert the building occupants. And also, ideally, at the same time, you're also alerting the local fire department so that they can begin to respond. Because that's really, in an existing building that may not have sprinklers, that's really going to be your primary fire safety force, right? It's getting the fire department there. Excuse me. The third very important element for maintaining life safety in a building is making sure you have that protected egress path. Ali touched on it a little bit. I won't go too much more into it. However, one of the things that is really critically important relative to the protected egress path, especially when you're talking, those vertical stairs within a high-rise building, is the stairs are only as good as the doors. And if the doors aren't closing, and if they're not latching, if they're not tight, they're not going to be very effective at minimizing smoke migration up through a building and or heat, fire movement up through the building. So providing that protected egress path and maintaining that protected egress path are really critical elements in an existing building. And then finally, the fourth element is you got to have the ability to contain or control fire spread. And, we're talking about typical residential occupancies here. First and foremost, these buildings, since they were predominantly from the, here in Chicago, we've got a lot of high-rise residential buildings that were all built in the 50s and 60s and 70s. None of them have any sprinklers. And we'll talk a little bit about the Chicago life safety evaluation approach or the retrofit approach here in a few minutes. But, these buildings were built under a building code that mandated really stout fire resistive construction. These buildings are basically built to withstand an apartment unit burnout. So we need to work with that. And Ali talked about it, minimizing the fire from spreading beyond the area of origin. And this is where apartment unit entry doors become very critical. And those have to also be maintained in good working order. They also need to be automatic closing. Unfortunately, we actually had a fire scenario here in Chicago where unsprinklered building, and the people in the unit couldn't find their cat. And so they were concerned to make sure the cat got out of the fire. So when they left their unit, which was on fire, they chalked the door open so the cat could get out. The unfortunate part is that fire got into the corridor. A young woman riding the elevator came up and was open to a floor, an inferno floor. But the point is that that apartment unit door, that main entry door, is also a part of the critical barrier. Okay, so if you can provide those four things in any existing building, you can reasonably assure that you can provide a reasonable level of life safety in an existing building. So there are definitely a number of things that you could look at doing. And while everybody would love to put sprinklers in all these buildings, the reality is financially, it's just not going to happen there in most buildings. So as much as that would be the preference, we have to look for other options. What Chicago did when they passed their life safety retrofit ordinance. So they had a couple of high-rise fires, and there had already been discussions going on. This is in the early 2000s. They had, there had been a couple of high-rise fires, one in particular in a commercial office building that unfortunately 6 people perished inside the stair. So lots of different issues at bay, but when Chicago passed their ordinance, they basically mandated that all commercial buildings, actually all high-rise buildings were required to be sprinkler protected. They were all required to have voice alarm systems retrofitted into them. And if they didn't already have standpipe systems, they were required to be provided with standpipe systems. So to Ali's point, the firefighting tools, that's a critical element as part of fighting a fire in any high-rise building, making sure that the fire department doesn't have to stretch hose up and down the stairs. Now, I said that the city code required sprinkler retrofit in all high-rise buildings, and that is the basic code requirement. However, because of the power of the lobby of residential building owners and their concerns about how they were going to pay for sprinkler retrofits, a system was developed, and it basically was it was referred to as a life safety evaluation, or an LSE. And if you're familiar with the National Fire Protection Association's NFPA 101A, the FSES approach, or Fire Safety Evaluation System, it's that kind of a system. Actually, the IBC does have in the International Existing Buildings Code, they do have a very comparable numerical methodology to be able to assess existing buildings, and that would include high-rise buildings, and to be able to come up with an alternative approach to perhaps having to provide sprinklers throughout the building. And so what these systems do is there's, I think in Chicago's case, the life safety evaluation had, I believe it was 28 different features that were to be assessed. And they ranged from building construction type, was it an acceptable construction type? Was it within the allowable height? Compartmentation, was there a reasonably good compartmentation on the floor? Elevator protection, emergency lighting, exit signage. What kind of smoke management might there be? Were there knockout windows where there needed to be, and was there ability to vent the smoke? What kind of smoke detection is there? So you look at each one of these 28 features, and you grade it. And the grades are, if you basically comply with what the code would have required, it was basically like a 0 score. If you didn't meet the code, it was kind of a negative score. And if you exceeded the code, it was a positive score. And at the end, you tally up you sum up all of the scores, and then you look for the minimum required score for the given occupancy. And in a nutshell, this is a way, kind of a numerical methodology approach to assess whether or not the fire safety in the existing building was reasonably provided. So this system could also be used as kind of a design guide. So let's say you wind up at you don't meet the minimum score requirement for the residential occupancy. You could go back and look and see where you were deficient in a given item, and you could perhaps make improvements in that item. Let's say smoke detection wasn't really done well in the building, so you go and you want to provide smoke detection. And there were different levels of smoke detection, right? There's smoke detectors just in the corridor, or there could be smoke detectors in the corridors and in each of the dwelling units. So and you could get a different amount of score if you put it in the dwelling units than if you just put it in the corridors. So it's a complicated system. I'm not interested in taking up all the time here to describe it, but I think you're getting the understanding and the picture of what it looks like. So again, I point out that the IEBC, and honestly, I don't know if New York City has adopted IEBC or not, but there is a very comparable numerical methodology already laid out in the IEBC. I guess a couple other quick comments, and then I'll turn it back over to the group. There have been, we've looked at a couple of different approaches utilizing as part of this life safety evaluation. I have been involved in a project where we wound up providing sprinklers inside of the corridors, and the fire department was willing to look at this approach. This is an existing building here somewhere else in this state of Illinois, outside of Chicago. They were willing to consider it, but they wanted us to provide a sprinkler over each door entering into the unit. So there was one sprinkler inside of every unit. And frankly, reasonably, that could make some sense from a couple of different perspectives. But I think the important point here is, I think we did wind up putting in sprinklers in those corridors. It's the only time I've ever done it in a project like that. And it was part of complying with an overall life safety assessment project or evaluation project. So there were other features that were also improved. It wasn't just going in and providing sprinklers in the corridors. There's other things that could be done. We've also looked at and have done smoke detection, say in a dormitory or in a residential unit, where again we put the corridor smokes, so that helps identify if you're impacting your egress paths. But then we also put system smoke detectors, not smoke alarms, but system smoke detectors inside the dorm room or inside the unit. And you can set those to operate at two different alarm thresholds. At the lower alarm threshold, they might operate like a smoke alarm so that they only alarm inside the unit. And then if the fire starts, it'll alert the people that are in the unit. It'll send a trouble signal to the building fire alarm panel. So it'll alert somebody, say in engineering, or somebody in building management, that there might be a problem in one of the tenant units. And then if the fire goes unchecked and it continues to develop smoke, you might hit that second alarm threshold on the detector. And now the detector becomes a building alarm device. It activates an alarm signal at the building fire alarm panel, which will summon the fire department. It'll also begin occupant evacuation based on whatever the local prescribed approach, whether it's a full building evacuation or just a handful of floors in a high rise, however that works. So those are a couple things we've done. I'm sure there's lots of questions. And actually, I'm going to turn it back over at this point.
Okay, Jeff, thank you so much for a view from the Midwest. We appreciate your thoughts on some suggestions here as well. Our final presenter today will be Atenedoro Gonzalez, who is a staff member along with the task force that was created after the Twin Parks fire. So, Atenedoro, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Like Ben said, my name is Atenedoro Gonzalez. I'm actually the general counsel to Council Member Oswald Feliz. I'm here on his behalf. Council Member Feliz is actually the chair of the New York City Twin Parks Task Force on Fire Prevention, which is a task force that was created in response to the Twin Parks fire. That was in our district, so Councilmember Feliz was there hands-on from when the issue started. Since then, the City Council has been taking a very strong approach to fire prevention and safety. Over the past few months, we've had a couple of bills passed through the committees, and so I'm really happy to talk about some of those bills right now. At least on our end, from Councilmember Feliz's office, we passed two bills. Intros 104 and 105. 104 further cements the definition of self-closing doors within the Housing Maintenance Code and the housing codes, to include language that the doors have to actually latch when they close, which is something that I believe Jeff brought up earlier. 105 also decreases the amount of time that landlords have to close self-closing doors to fix, self-closing door violations. The self-closing doors were a big issue with the Twin Parks fire. All of the deaths happened because of asphyxiation from smoke, which resulted from a faulty self-closing door. So we really wanted to take an approach on trying to figure out a way to save lives. While we're not able to stop fires completely from happening, we want to figure out ways that we can kind of aid in the efforts of saving lives and maintaining safety in our buildings. We've also increased fines and penalties for violations on self-closing doors and increased fines and violations on landlords who lie about certifying self-closing door violations. We're also putting more of an onus on the city agencies that are involved in these inspections and forcing them to physically go back into buildings and reinspect self-closing door violations. Along with the task force, there were other bills that were also passed in relation to fire safety. The cause of the fire was a malfunctioning space heater. So Councilmember Shahana Hanif passed Intro 106, which puts more limits and standards on space heaters. Another issue, well, why people even need to use space heaters are because of the inadequate heat in New York City during heat season, which is during the winter months. So another bill was put in that has not passed yet to increase the minimum temperature required in New York City apartments. Intro 115 also, I'm sorry, that was intro 115. Intros 133 and intros 208, these are by council members Natasha Williams, relate to inspections of automatic sprinkler systems and standpipe tests, requiring that the FDNY actually physically inspect these things every 3 years. And lastly, intros 208 discusses standards set for self-closing doors. So something that we didn't even realize before this tragedy happened was how much is involved in a self-closing door. It's not just the door that actually closes. The door itself needs to have certain standards in order to make sure that it's functioning what it's supposed to function as. So a method of keeping fires inside of a room, making sure smoke is not coming out, so that it gives the fire department time to be able to come into the building and actually fight the fires. So these are some of the intros that we've been working on. In order to do this, we've obviously been having to have a lot of meetings with experts in the field. So we've met with several engineers, structural engineers, and with the fire department and fire marshals to kind of figure out ways that we can promote safety in the city. Something else that we're trying to work on now is increasing fire education. We also didn't realize this at council, but there are a lot of buildings that are rated to survive fires. Sometimes it's actually safer for residents to stay inside of their apartments when there's a fire happening. That way the fire department can come in, safely get folks out, and then focus on fighting the fires where they need to fight them. So increasing education within the residents about these types of buildings, maybe even possibly creating intercom systems so that the fire department can adequately communicate with residents in buildings where there is a fire. So these are just some of the things that we've been trying to work on the task force. The task force is only about 4 months in. We've been working closely with the chairs of the Fire and Safety Committee and the Housing and Buildings Committee. Both chairs are also members of the task force. So we're all working together to try to figure out how best to tackle this issue and how to keep our residents in New York City safe. I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Atenedoro. Just a reminder to everyone, we would like any questions or perhaps even comments that you have, put them in the chat room. Charles Jennings has actually posted the task force document in that chat room. So if you'd like to take a look at that, you can click on that link. And so I guess get the questioning going here. Atenedoro, what do you see as perhaps next steps, maybe 6 months or a year from now? What do you think the task force will be looking at going forward? You talked about issuing regulations for specifically for doors, and of course inspections of standpipes and sprinklers or what have you. What do you think might happen down the road? What do you think is brewing out there?
So immediately we're looking towards the educational component. Another intro was passed recently by Chair Sanchez of the Housing and Buildings Committee to put more funding towards education on fire safety. We think, at least Councilmember Feliz's belief is, we had a lot of PSAs over the last few years over COVID safety and vaccine safety, and there's no reason why we can't have something like that on an ongoing yearly basis to continue to promote fire safety. In conversations we've had with fire marshals, we've learned that in a lot of these newer buildings, the doors have notices on them indicating things to do during a fire, whether you should just stay inside of your apartment in the fire. But as we know, a lot of folks don't like these signs. They paint over them, they take the signs off. And then when new residents come into the building afterwards, no one has this information. So kind of increasing the education, not just on in school, but also on TV ads, on radio stations, and making sure that the information is something that's constantly and continuously going out to our residents. So that's the immediate next steps. There are a couple of more bills that we're waiting and pending in committee that haven't come out yet. And so we're working together with the sponsors of those bills to try to figure out when those bills will be coming forward, what information they need in order to make sure that we get this moving forward. In the conversations that we were having with the standards and inspections for self-closing doors, that one is one of the bills that's still in the committee, hasn't come out of committee yet. And so they're working with experts to kind of figure out what the standards need to be so that when city agencies like HPD or Department of Buildings come in to inspect an apartment, they know what they're looking for rather than just a door that closes.
Okay, thank you, Atenedoro. We have our first question from Dean. I'm just going to paraphrase. Basically, Dean, and I'll throw this out to the panel, what your thoughts are. Dean highlights specifically existing high-rises that have passive protection, basically things that stand and look at you, but aren't dynamic, the opposite of that. So compartmentation, walls, doors, what have you. And he's specifically asking about what do we think about these older existing high-rise buildings that are basically relying completely on compartmentation, and how do we know that going forward that will continue to perform as it was originally designed maybe 40, 50 years ago, right? So that's, as we know, as I mentioned earlier, that it wasn't until really the late 70s until we got the very first set of high-rise requirements nationally, which call for more active fire protection in the form of sprinklers and detection and things like that. So again, the question is passive protection. Can we still rely on that? What do we have to worry about? Those kind of things. Anybody in our panel have any comments?
Glenn, I can take that first, and anyone else can jump in too. It's a really good question. It certainly points to something true, which is the nature of fire inside the buildings has changed over time because of the materials that we have. So for example, it used to take much longer to get to flashover. Now you might get to flashover in 5 minutes inside the building because the contents just catch much faster. And so a flashover in 5 minutes is an entirely different risk to the people inside the building, and then also the impact on the building itself, the fire response, all of that. So having said that, a challenge of the way that the building codes do handle fire in general is that we have specific prescriptive safety measures, but we don't have quantified performances. And so unlike, this question is really to some extent a structural question, unlike, for example, an earthquake event where we could say we are designing for an earthquake which has this much probability of happening, and we're designing to achieve that level of reliability. When it comes to the passive protection for the building, you have fire rating systems, fire ratings for the passive protection, but they look at individual components of the building. They don't look at the building as a system. And so whereas you might have 2-hour fire rating for individual parts of the building, we don't, for example, have the fire rating for the connections. There's no testing for the connections, right? So you might have a building that has a fire rating and it has a 2-hour rating and it stands for 1 hour. Or you might have a building that has 2-hour ratings and stands for 4 hours. And by that time, the fire has died, right? And so we can certainly do that analysis if needed. And if you do that, then you could look at old fires, but you could also look at the new fires. But that's not typically done. I think that's a good question. And certainly for buildings where the resilience becomes more important. So it's a very important building. You cannot risk a potential collapse at some point. People can't get out of the building. The building has a lot of functionalities. The building is inside a dense urban area like New York. If we need to look at that resilience, we can certainly do that, but it's not part of the standard design process.
Glenn, this is Jeff.
I was just going to say, Jeff, go ahead.
Well.
You had a comment. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. So by and large, and this is a broad generalization, but I think it's a reasonably good generalization, and that is that fire resistance of an assembly, unless somebody has done something to the assembly, the fire resistance of the assembly is going to remain intact. And so, generally speaking, the walls, the partitions in a residential building that we need to rely on from a fire resistance standpoint, certainly the floor and the floor deck above, But then there's also the walls that separate the unit from the corridor, and then the walls that separate, one tenant from the other. By and large, those walls don't get a lot of damage, generally speaking, unless somebody bought both units and is now opening it up to make one big unit. The point is, I think you could rely on the passive nature of the building fire resistance as long as these main walls are in reasonably good condition. And if somebody poked a hole, they repaired the hole, right? Or they repaired the penetration. So those are the things that, an inspection program, that's why it's important to really get a good look at the doors. And at the same time, if there's a giant hole in the stairwell from, a pipe that might have gone through there at one point, if that hole's not repaired, it needs to get repaired. But by and large, the fire resistance of that assembly should be reasonably maintainable.
Okay, thank you. We've got several more questions coming in. Maybe I'll direct these to specific people. Charles, we've got a question comment from our friend Paul Grimman across the pond. He'd like to get your thoughts on, and perhaps others, on the issue of public address systems within high-rises, the ability for the fire department to communicate with the occupants and giving them instruction and things along those lines. So, Charles, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's great to have Paul on, and I know we've got a real heavy-duty panel of experts on the call. So I absolutely would concur. I'm trying not to opine on a particular solution, but I think, certainly my analysis that I've done over the years, and I've got as an example here, I'll just throw up on the screen. This goes back to 1995, if you can see it. This was looking primarily at the commercial an office building high-rise fire problem, but at that time, I basically identified public address as a key building block in order to properly manage occupants in a tall building. So I would absolutely concur with you on that. That I think it is an important building block for any fire safety solution, particularly given the defend in place, or as we say in the UK, the stay put debate, which I'm sure we'll talk about before we're off the line today. So thank you for that.
Well, I would also like to comment on that as well, if I can.
Go ahead.
So a little bit of background for myself and Counsel member Feliz. We're both former housing attorneys. We represented tenants in the Bronx for several years. And this is something that we've brought about to the rest of the members of the task force. The issue that we've seen, at least in communities like the Bronx or other low-income communities, is that many times their intercom systems do not work. It would be nice if this is something that was working across the board that we could depend on. But in the majority of buildings that we've represented here in the Bronx, the intercoms simply don't work. You also have some issues of language barrier access, where you'll have a lot of folks in buildings that don't speak English, at least in the Twin Parks building, for example. Most of the folks there came from Gambia and they did not speak any English. So we're trying to figure out ways to combat this. And one of the things we talked about was the PSAs and the media outreach in languages within the particular demographics. So we would be sending out commercials, for example, in the languages that are most common in that demographic, so that we can make sure that the information is there, so that folks know, what to do when a fire happens. And I think there was a question down the line in regards to communicating with landlords and groups about this. We really think the media is the big way to do this. Folks are watching ads online, whether they're watching YouTube videos or they're on Instagram, or they have kids who are in school and getting this information from there or on TV. We really think the media is the big way to do it. And we saw how it worked with things around COVID. We all know at least those of us in New York, we saw all of the Dr. Joshki commercials, all the commercials from the Department of Health. So we know that the information is available. They can do it in different languages. It's just a matter of putting the funding so that we can have these agencies create these PSAs and put them out for the members of the community.
Okay, thank you, Atenedoro. The next comment question we have is from Russ, and Russ points out an interesting piece of technology. He apparently was in a hotel recently, and the hotel door did not close all the way, and there's an alarm that went off, as he used an analogy of like a seatbelt alarm. Any thoughts, comments on that, folks? That's something new I haven't heard of before, so interesting. Anybody wants to say? Okay, well, it sounds interesting, Russ. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, Glenn, I was just going to say that while I can't say that I've seen specifically what Russ is commenting on, I could see if that was something that was of interest, you could certainly put door contacts for the security system on the door, and then that would let you know whether or not the door has been closed over time. So I could see how that could be done. You may want to, if that's intended for a fire protection purpose, you may want to start thinking about how do we protect the cabling going to the door contacts, but that's all achievable. But I don't know that I necessarily see how that could be beneficial in an existing residential occupancy. So I think the money, since we all know funds are going to be limited, I think it could be better spent elsewhere, but I can see that.
Interesting. We've got, like I said, we've got several comments here. We've got our next from our friend Beth Tubbs, who brings up the issue of retrofitting exterior cladding systems onto older high-rise buildings. So basically, applying insulating materials, exterior finishes, what have you. Is there any special consideration, she asks, when they're proposed to be installed that lack, of course, again, perhaps pre-1975 high-rises, those older high-rises? Is there any sort of thought about how we handle doing something like that, particularly within our, and I'm just going to add this on myself, within our own code enforcement context here? So any thoughts about that? Exterior cladding, exterior insulation. Jeff, you want to try that one too?
Sure. I think. Did you say her Beth's question was in regards to when you're going through and doing a replacement, or determining whether or not you need to replace because it was combustible in the first place?
No, I think what she's saying is that we're going back and applying exterior cladding systems, exterior insulating systems on these older high-rises that really lack a lot of the sort of more fundamental fire safety features that we'd have in the current requirements in the building code, for example.
Sure. Well, interestingly, back in the early House proceedings that I think Charles was kind of referring to, the GSA-funded panel of international folks. In the early House proceedings, they definitely looked for non-combustible buildings if we're going to have high-rise buildings with, people above the reach of a fire department ladder. And it's unfortunate that over the years, because of energy efficiency, we've begun to allow certain materials to be used in an exterior facade, but the codes today are pretty well developed and identify precisely what should be put onto that building, relative to what's an appropriate facade system or exterior wall system. The question, I think, really is some of the older buildings, and I think the combustible exterior wall construction issue really kind of came to light more in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even the 2000s, before the codes really started to change a little bit. But of course, unfortunately, we still see incidents where a combustible material was put on the outside of the building inappropriately. But I think the best question, the codes today are pretty straightforward relative to the use of, NFPA 285 tested assemblies.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Ali, do you want to comment?
Yeah, if I can just add a broad comment, I think Beth's question is also a broad question of you have existing buildings and you keep changing and maintaining them over time. I think it's a good question of, is there a point where it makes sense to look at the holistic behavior of the system in terms of its fire safety and not just look at how you're changing the components of the system piecewise? And that's always a good idea. Not that it's always done, but certainly fire safety is a holistic thing. And whereas the provisions go in different sections of the code, looking at it holistically allows you to make sure that you actually have a safe system.
Very good. Thank you. The next question is from Anna, comment from Anna, and it's actually directed toward Atenedoro. And before I ask the question, Atenedoro, we want to thank you for being here today and also Council Member Feliz's participation in this task force. So thank you very much. Anna's question focuses primarily on fire safety education within buildings. So for example, families, people live in the buildings. What are your thoughts about having the landlords / owners, managers, have a more proactive approach at actually having fire safety education within the buildings?
I think it's a good idea. When we were trying to figure out ways to provide this information, some of the things we thought about was in lease renewals or in lease, or when a tenant gets a new lease. Unfortunately, those documents tend to be really long and most people don't read them. They just sign where they need to sign. So we're trying to figure out ways to get notices to tenants. In city-owned buildings, I think it might be easier when we have situations like a NYCHA building. NYCHA right now, it has several agreements with a federal appointed monitor because of a lot of issues that we've had with NYCHA. Actually, one of the things we wanted to do was force NYCHA to install heat sensors in all buildings. And then we realized this was something that they've already agreed to with the federal monitor. So we are having conversations with the federal monitor to see if there are other things we can ask NYCHA to do. Surprisingly enough, City Council doesn't have too much authority over NYCHA. That is a state thing, but we are working with the federal monitor to figure out ways to provide notices. NYCHA also knows the language, the preferred language for all of their tenants, so it would be a lot easier if NYCHA would do this. So that is a conversation that we are having. In terms of private buildings, I think that is a little bit more difficult because we also have to think about enforcement. We can have a requirement that landlords have to have these meetings, but how are we actually going to enforce that? And then also finding times for tenants to be able to participate in these meetings. It's another issue that we've been having. So I think, like I mentioned before, we're really trying to push hard on the media presence. Everyone at some point is going to be watching their television or listening to a podcast or watching a video with an ad on it. And we're hoping that at some point, maybe those targeted ads might be able to provide the information that we need for tenants to have.
Thank you, Atenedoro. Thank you very much. Our next comment question is from Chief Jim Murtaugh. Jim is known to many of us on this call. Jim, of course, was a faculty member at John Jay as well as a chief officer in the FDNY. And more recently, many of you don't know, is that along with Jack Murphy, also on this call today, along with Jerry Tracy, the authors of a brand new book on high-rise firefighting, the first one really since O'Hagan's book back in the early 70s. So it's on its way. Hopefully you'll be out available pretty soon. And we're looking forward to that because, like I said, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 50 years, basically, in high-rise firefighting. So Jim's comments had to do actually take a step beyond this, the apartment door, but the stairwell door, right? So issues of the stairwell doors being propped open for a variety of reasons to clear, food smells, heat, whatever. There's a big problem there with the stairs as well. And he also mentioned specifically very often the skylights at the top of these stairwells being taken out, which of course, for the firefighting folks on this call know that without a window on top of that stairwell, it basically provides a much more efficient chimney for smoke and heat to rise up through that stairwell. So any comments about that, specifically about going beyond the apartment door and looking at stairwell doors and other openings?
Glenn, let me just kick that off, and is that I think one of the recurring themes, and I'm tracking all the comments, and it's great to see them, is that ultimately what I'd like to see the panel comment on kind of resilience or redundancy, and the fact that the system that we're reliant on, for many buildings in New York City has a single point of failure, which is that apartment door. And that, in spite of some of the regulatory fixes, and is still fun, can be defeated, right? Can be defeated by a welcome mat that gets tangled up as you're on your way out the door, right? And so, what do we think about resilience and redundancy, and where can we go from kind of to further safety beyond that, just the door closer issue?
Okay, any other comments there?
Yeah, so we in Intro 106, we did try to differentiate a little bit between the apartment self-closing doors and the common area self-closing doors, mainly for the enforcement aspect, for HPD's sake at least. HPD's main complaint has always been tenant participation. They'll go in to inspect, and if a tenant isn't home or doesn't allow them in, then how can they inspect? So we added where HPD has to make reasonable attempts to get in touch with a tenant in order to inspect an apartment self-closing door, but also maintaining that the common area self-closing doors do have to be inspected. And that is something that HPD is responsible for at this point. Intro 208, which is, I said, not out yet, will have the standards for these types of inspections and should be differentiating between apartment self-closing doors and common area and hallway self-closing doors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next comment is from north of the border, I believe, J. Gordon Ratley, another friend of ours, who I'm going to paraphrase his comments in the chat. Basically, he is saying that if, sprinklers are the answer. That's the bottom line. Sprinklers are the answer to solving this problem. And if you're unable to do that, it's too daunting a task, as the words he used, then we've got to make sure these doors are closing properly, because without that, then we've got problems. So thank you to Gordon. Let's see what's next on the list. Chief Murtaugh, again, the role in fire investigations for all major fires is what we need, and of course, to pass that information on to the legislature as well. Joey Goldberg, go ahead, Charles.
Jack had a question there about the feasibility of some form of fire safety director, as we have in commercial buildings in the city. I don't know if you want to set that up, or.
Yeah, well, I guess what I didn't see that. There's a whole bunch here I'm going through, so I didn't see his comment. But I think what Jack is advocating for is, of course, to extend the fire safety director program, which has been very successful for commercial buildings, office building, high rises, and hotels. But at residential, it stays at hotels. It doesn't apply to existing to existing residential high rises in general. So certainly that's something I think should be looked at, no question about it, because
this is Jack.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jack.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little issue with the chat. I can't get in. So
okay.
I believe, Charles, we put that the fire safety director in the residential buildings and fire wardens, and when we pass it down from the NFPA high rise committee. I know definitely it's wardens, and I'm trying to think about the fire directors.
Right.
Question for
right.
Charles.
Right. Okay.
Oh, well, I don't have that in front of me, Jack.
Yeah.
I think we may have done that. I certainly, it was a practice that we recommended,
Yeah.
but I will kind of turn that back on the, I guess put Atenedoro on the hot seat, which is, you've been doing too well, Atenedoro. So here you go. There's another one.
No worries. We've actually had this conversation plenty of times. We've met with fire marshals a bunch on this issue. And it was very surprising to us that they don't inspect residential buildings often. So we are trying to figure out a way to kind of take the responsibility of these inspections away from HPD and to the FDNY. I believe, and don't quote me on this, Council Member Ariola, who is the chair of the Fire and Safety Committee, is potentially working on legislation around this. So this is a conversation we've been having. It's something we're aware of. It's an issue that we're aware of. And we do believe that the best people to inspect these things are not HPD, but are actually folks of the fire department. They are the experts on this. Firefighters fight these fires on a daily basis, and they rely on the expertise of the fire marshals to be able to inspect these buildings and make sure they are safe for firefighters to come in the event that fires happen. So it's definitely a conversation we're having, and hopefully it's something that could potentially be resolved. I'm not going to say this year, but where we are aware of it.
Okay. Thank you. I
Glenn,
actually,
if I can add
yes,
just
go
one
ahead.
thing
Yeah.
in response to what Charles mentioned, which was really the key point. Like you look at a lot of these buildings and we have 1-2 places where are the more frequent sources of the problems. And sometimes we could do anything in terms of having the right system and the door still will be left open because a human being will keep it open, right? Because they want to get the heat out, get the odor out, all of that, right? So we need to, I think, realize that even with the best system, and if the system is mechanically okay, the humans might override that and we might not have the perfect system in place because of that. And so the question of resilience becomes really important. And I think there are 2 things to highlight here. One is, I see it in the comments too, that the condition in the building could change very quickly. And so the ability to decide and communicate in real time is really important. I think that's very relevant. And the second thing is, the range of things that can be done is wide. And I don't think we have all the answers. And I don't think all the potential solutions have been studied. And so as we're looking at this as a global problem, we really do need to also identify what are the things that we could study further so that maybe the right solution in New York and something that's feasible in New York is different from the right solution in Chicago versus the right solution in some place where they don't have the same resources, but they have the same problem.
Right.
Glenn?
Which leads me to believe maybe it's 50 years since that conference I mentioned earlier, Ali, in Washington, D.C., that looked at the high-rise fire problem. Maybe we should reconvene it to look at existing buildings, have a more national approach to this. John Pearson, I actually skipped over him. John Pearson had a good comment specifically about the involvement of our forgotten about partners here, the insurance industry. Perhaps they can play a role here by offering reduced rates for sprinklers and things like that as an encouragement to do that. I know that in the past that the insurance industry has played a big role in quote unquote encouraging building owners to do the right thing by challenging them on not writing insurance or increasing their premiums dramatically. That might be a part of the solution here, is to get them much more directly involved here, because they do, again, play a critical role. Let's see. Let's see. Let me get back to. Let's see. Russ just points out that there's the International High-Rise Fire Safety Conference last week in London. That again, there's a lot of discussion about firefighters need a plan A, B, and C as opposed to just plan A. So important information to be able to deal with a particular fire at the moment. Jay Goldberg supports the. Joy Goldberg supports the use of the detectors for the doors. That's she's totally on board with that. Chief Lieb basically has a comment here about smoke alarms going off with food on the stove and those kind of things, even with automatic notification of the fire department. The implications of that are enormous when we talk about the alarms coming in and it happening so often. It's something that we've got to deal with. And I know it's been discussed for a long time, is how do you deal with internal smoke detectors within units on where that alarm goes besides the unit, right? Do we notify the fire department immediately? Those kind of things. So it's certainly a balancing act. Chief Murtaugh again, let's see, major high-rise fires occurring around the world, more and more people moving into high-rise, and there's a growing significance. We need central data collection investigation so we can share the data, sort of a worldwide approach to high-rise living and specifically fires. Dominic DeRubio, would the panel be open to requiring a BIC, building information card, that Jack Murphy is very familiar with, for residential buildings similar to those we have for office buildings and things like that after 9/11. So any comments on that from the panel? Maybe even Jack, if you want to unmute Jack, Charles, you can do that. Maybe he might want to opine on that.
Yeah, this is Jack. Yeah, I'll try to opine on that. You know, I'm professing a lot. I call K by G, know before you go mentality. We go to battle every day in these buildings. We have very little intelligence on it. And the intelligence that we have, a lot of it is old. We don't keep up to it with annual updates of the bit card. That's number one. So that's a key thing there. Need intelligence to make decision-based knowledge that Jim Murtaugh told me about years ago. The other thing too, let me just back up on what's out there and what's not being adopted. NFPA 101 and the internet and the international existing building code has language for existing buildings to retrofit. We put these things on the national level, but the local level does nothing. And yet we come up with schemes. I'm sorry to pick on Harper. We come up with schemes to get around it in Chicago. Let's have a complicated system that he is an engineer, can't figure out. Now he wants me or the building owner to figure out. So those are things there that are still out there. We need to adopt what we push forward. We have a hard enough time with the industry to get things in. Now that it's in there, it's up to the locals to adopt that. The other thing too is retrofitting the existing. Glenn and I came up with, we went before all the Beaumont people in New Jersey 10 years ago. And just what one gentleman said, Harper, put one sprinkler head over the door. They wouldn't buy into it. We said, wait, we'll work with you. When the apartment comes vacant as a condo or a rental, we'll fit it. And the last thing here, and I'll be very frank with this, the federal government has to get into adopting local codes. You can't put on the GSA website, we don't adopt any local codes. What message does that send to the rest of the world? So those are the things here that are boiling out there for years. I need people to step up and now take charge.
Thank you, Jack. I see a couple more comments from Jay Gordon Rowley, the sage of all things fire safety. So he's again makes the point here. We got to build this in. We have to build in protection. We cannot rely on just human behavior to sort of deal with these situations and things. So that's an important part of this, is that we cannot rely just on humans by themselves to sort of take care of this problem. It's a much larger issue for all of us. So it is now almost 3 o'clock. We're getting toward the end of our session today. Let's go around the room one more time from our presenters. Charles, you want to kick it off? Any final comments here?
I think as somebody who's been involved in advocacy around high-rise fire safety in New York in particular, going back well before 9/11, Glenn, and we've been shoulder to shoulder on a lot of that. It's time. It's been time. We've got to go forward. We've got to improve the level of safety in these existing buildings. And there's, it's going to be difficult, but I think what we're hearing today, is really a good faith, exploration of that space of potential solutions that are out there. And, we're moving forward, and I want to give a lot of credit to Councilmember Feliz and to City Council for forming the task force. And I'm, bless you all, and don't lose focus and keep going. And that's all I would say for that. And thank you, everybody. We've got just a tremendous group of participants today. And so many experts out there who I would be turning to for advice on these things. So thank you.
Exactly. Ali?
I just wanted to thank you and the Reagan Heart Center for organizing this event. I think it's a really important topic. And so thank you for fostering the conversation, and hopefully it will lead somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jeff, any closing comments from the Windy City?
Yeah, I think that I absolutely agree. We need to build systems in to obviate reliance upon human nature. And that's easy when we're building a building from the ground up. In an existing building that doesn't have some of these systems that we need to rely upon, it becomes much more reliant upon not allowing human nature to negate the ability of the systems that are in place. So what I'm getting at is public education on the importance and the safety of making sure these doors close. It's a critical piece. I mean, we can design all kinds of systems, and unless they're going to get funded and put in place, we have to take advantage of and make sure people understand the importance of the systems they have in front of them.
Exactly. Exactly. And finally, Atenedoro, again, as Charles mentioned earlier, thank you for being on with us today. We're going to hold you to that to keep moving forward, okay? So we want you to keep doing what you're doing. So don't give up. Keep the foot on the accelerator. So we appreciate that. So any comments from you, Atenedoro?
Yes, first, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and to, discuss these issues with you guys. I've also definitely learned a lot through this experience. And, I actually wanted to touch base on something that Jay Gordon mentioned in his comment and their comment about what was happening in this building before. And I'll be very quick about it. But, as former housing attorneys, we've seen that, at least in this building, there were violations for self-closing doors before. The violations were clear. Whether they were cleared because the violation was actually corrected or not is up for debate. In my practice and in Counsel Feliz's practice, since we both work in the same place, landlords lie. And lying is, well, not all landlords, but some landlords lie. And that's a part of their business practice. They'll take the fine and the penalties because it's cheaper to accept the fine rather than to fix the actual problem. And that's what our bills hope to address. We're quadrupling a lot of these fines. Some of these fines were $150 to $200, and now they're $1,000+ for these violations and penalties and fines. And we're hoping that we're going to hit landlords in their pocket where they care, where it will become something where if they don't fix it, then they're going to lose a lot more money than what they would have lost before. Because we can't rely on the good, faithful folks in this world to fix these issues on their own. So we're really hoping that these bills do this, that they have the result that, another tragedy like this won't happen again. Again, like I said, we can't prevent fires from happening. That's something that we can do, but we can make sure at least that the systems are in place so that folks are protected and that firefighters are protected so that when you do go into these buildings to fight the fires, they can do their actual job, and also for the help protect the people that are in these buildings and get them out safely rather than be impeded, facing issues of doors that are malfunctioning, and then folks die because of smoke inhalation. So again, thank you all for the opportunity. Councilman Feliz says thank you for the opportunity, and definitely hope to partner with you guys again at some point in the future.
Thank you, Atenedoro. Thank you again for being here. So this will conclude actually the last of our speaker series for this current semester at John Jay College. We'll be back in the fall with a series of new lectures and webinars on a variety of topics. And again, if you're not familiar with the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies, it is named, of course, after Christian Regenhard, a probationary firefighter killed in 9/11, as a legacy to his memory. Our RACERS Center does enormous amount of outreach in this format, as well as research into emergency responder issues in general. And so we welcome you to go to our website and sign up for future webinars. And Charles, I'll turn it back to you. Do you want to have any last comments?
Glenn, I would just once again thank everybody. I think you said it. This is like thank God it's Friday for the center seminars. So we're happy to go out strong, but it's been great, and we look forward to seeing everybody again in the fall. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yep. Have a good day.